In this video, we're going to take a look at Jane Austen Violet. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink. This is a nice dusty purple with a little bit of tone variation, sometimes depending on the pen, but mostly predictable, which makes this especially good because I like those predictable, boring inks. I like to know what I'm going to get. It shades well and really consistently. This has a very cool effect. It's a bit of a color tone change as it dries, and you may not be able to see it right here as obviously, but watch during the writing samples when I'm using the double broad and it'll be much more noticeable. Now, dusty purples aren't usually for me. It's just that I don't normally go for them. This may be an ink to change my mind. It is definitely interesting enough for me to get another sample and to give that one a ride and see how it goes. Try it out with as many different pens as I can and see if it stays this consistent, because it's light and dusty, but it's easy to read. It's really very pleasant. It's leaning me towards, quite possibly, my first dusty purple. I think that's pretty noteworthy as an ink. I like to change things up by using a different pen each day. Today that pen is a Noodler's Neponset with a music nib. It's inked up, used for a day, and used to take the notes for this video. To see how I arrived at that opinion, let's take a look at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine. Looking at the fine nib, we see that we get no feather and no spread, which I would frankly be surprised if it happened on this paper. We see some shading, but not nearly as much as we're really going to see the rest of the way through. The fine didn't do especially well, but not too bad. It's just that it's going from lighter to mid-tones. It's doing it very frequently. You see it in When, in the right and middle line. You see it in Newton's. You see it in Friend. It's just that the shading doesn't have as many dark spots as I would have expected. Looking at the medium nib, we see that we get roughly the same tone that we had with the fine. We get no feather, we get no spread, we certainly get quite a bit more shading, especially over onto the right side of the paper where it's flatter on the desk. The left side, the notebook's lifting up a little bit and affecting a little bit of how I'm writing, which is affecting the way the ink is looking. I think this looks especially good here, really does. I'm going to remind you to take a look at the tone shift that goes on as this ink dries. Now, with that, we're not getting any feather or spread, which we really don't think we would get on this paper. We get shading like a monster. It looks so good. It really does. The entire time, it goes from much lighter tones to much darker. Look at the word mystical. Look at and. Heretical. It's really very nice. Looking at the back of the page, you see that we get no bleeding and no ghosting. To have a range of experience with this ink, all of the writing samples are done with a Pelikan M120 Idyllic Blue with a fine nib, a Pelikan P200 with a medium nib, a Pelikan M205 the Duo Highlighter with a double broad nib. The next writing sample is done on a WritePad's reporter pad. Looking at the fine nib, we get very much the same tone that we had on the Clairfontaine. We're not getting any feathering. We're not getting any spread. We are getting some shading. Not real standout, but I think it is actually shading a bit better than what we had on the Clairfontaine. I think it looks better here with the slightly more absorbent paper than that super smooth Clairfontaine. Certainly something to take note of. Looking at the medium nib, we get about the same tone that we had with the fine. We get no feather, no spread. Yes, it shades. I think it shades as well as the medium did on the Clairfontaine. I think we're going to see it do fairly well this whole way through. Again, it's shading well on a more absorbent paper, which speaks to how this dusty tone is really working when you layer back over itself or it has a little moment of some more ink flow. Looking at the double broad, it looks a little bit darker than we had with the fine and the medium. We're not getting any feathering. Very surprised. We're not getting any spread. Very surprised. We are getting great shading. Look at that top line, the word friends. Now, I need to write better with a broad, and I really need unlined paper, but the shading that's going on there looks made up. How well it goes from dark straight into light, back to dark, with a dark dot on the eye. Looking at the back of the page, we see that we get no bleeding, no ghosting, no problem writing on the back. I agree with Vita. There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The next writing sample is done in a FieldNotes reporter's notebook. Looking at the fine nib, we get about the same tone that we had on the last paper. We get no feather. We get no spread. We get almost no shading. Yes, when we see the word Luther, the middle of it is a bit darker. Religious has certainly got a little bit of tone shift, but for the most part, without looking for the shading, it looks just as a lighter, dusty purple. And even some of that dusty look of it kind of gets lost on this paper. It more comes across as a very light purple. Looking at the medium nib, we get about the same tone that we had with the fine. We get no feather. We get no spread. We get almost no shading, just like with the fine. And just like with the fine, we can actually really look at it and find where it's there, but nothing is standing out and really drawing great positive attention to what we're writing, just coming across as a light purple. Looking at the double broad, it is about the same tone that we had with the medium and the fine. We get feathering. Fairly consistent, but really tiny. I think in the first word, brought at the top, it really shows itself. In the word in on the third line, it really shows itself. Spread is really under control, to be quite honest. Not doing too bad. Shading, like with the others, it's almost non-existent, but when you see the word Cambridge, you do notice how much darker it gets. And from the third to the fourth line, when the G of age crosses the D of combined, Looking at the back of the page, we see that it is getting deep into the page, but nothing came through and touched the page underneath. I just don't know that you could use the back of the page because of the ghosting.
Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. This smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it.
And here we see the results of the resistance test.
The next writing sample is done in a Portage reporter's notebook.
Looking at the fine nib, we get a nice, little bit darker looking of a tone of purple than we had on the last paper. We're not getting any kind of feathering. We're not getting any kind of spread. We are seeing the shading show itself a little bit better. Look at on the second line, chronology, where you see the H and the L and the Y are a bit darker than the rest of the word. In of on the third line goes from lighter to darker. I think it's showing better here. Looking at the medium nib, it is roughly the same tone that we had with the fine. We get no feather, we get no spread. The shading, I think, is starting to look a whole lot better here. It's not just getting kind of darker, it's getting much darker. Look at Bible, look at those, look at described. You see dark letters really popping on the page quite a bit throughout this writing. Makes it look pretty darn good. Looking at the double broad, if you were to use a double broad on a reporter notebook, this would do fairly well. It's a little darker than we had with the fine or the medium. It's not feathering, it's not spreading, it's shading and looking particularly good. Now, at the end of this, you're going to see me change my mind on a word and cross it out. That's going to be interesting to see if it actually causes any kind of a bleed issue. Looking at the back of the page, the ghosting looks way under control. I think you could use the back of the page and nothing bled through and touched. Not even where I crossed out that word.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables.
Here is Diamine Bilberry.
Here is Mont Blanc Lavender Purple. Here is Pelican Amethyst. Here is Sailor Lamont. The next writing sample is done in an Office Depot reporter's notebook.
Looking at the fine nib, it's a purple. It's a purple. It's feathers, yes. It's disappointing considering it does so well all the way up to this paper, and it's always the case. It spreads, yes. I do think both of those are under control and that you can use them. It's just that having seen the other writing samples, it makes you kind of disappointed here. You get no shading, but you get nothing that you really want to look at on this paper with this ink either. Looking at the medium nib, we get about the same tone that we had with the fine. We get about the same performance as well, meaning that it feathers fairly consistently, but fairly small. You could probably live with it if you had to. Does it spread? Just a little bit. Does it shade? Technically, there's a few spots that are darker, so I guess you could say yes, where the cross in the T crosses the H in theology. It's darker, but other than that, I really wouldn't say this is shading. Looking at the double broad nib, we have about the same tone that we had with the fine and the medium. It feathers, of course, and a lot, but always small, just woolly looking. It spreads, but really very little, and that's probably because it's eating up the feathers as it does it. It doesn't shade, and I can't read anything that I wrote. I feel like that comment right there is actually picking on my horrific handwriting. Looking at the page underneath, you see it is a veritable minefield of spots that I have circled where it touched those pages, making it unusable. When we see the back of the page, we understand why, as there's no writing on the back of the page with its ghosting or bleeding.
While it's nice to find other inks in the same color family, I'd prefer to find an ink that complements its color on the page. Here is a green ink by Bookbinders, their Emerald Boa Snake. Here is a gray ink by Mont Blanc, their 90 Years Gray. Here is a pink ink by Zenzoi, their Sweet Pink. Here is a yellow ink by Diatramentis, their Mahatma Gandhi or Saffron. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Looking at the fine nib, I'm reminded of some Muppets, perhaps, because it's purple and woolly. So it feathers, it spreads, it doesn't shade, it is purple on the page. Technically, you can use it for writing, which we can call that a nice thing if what you see here you think of as a nice thing. Really, we have to stop using nice ink on crappy paper. Looking at the medium nib, it's very much like the fine. Not surprising at all. It feathers, yes. It spreads, yes. Both are expected. Both are a shock if they don't happen. It doesn't shade. Again, something that we don't really expect here. It is disappointing. Looking at the double broad, it doesn't feather nearly as much as I would expect it to. When I started with this, I just expected to see nastiness. And to be honest with you, it actually is the best of all three that's there. Is there some spread? Yes. But I think the spread evenly ate up almost all of the feathering. It barely feathers at all. It's not shading, but that's okay. Again, while there is a tiny bit of feathering, the spread really ate it up, making this look pretty good. Looking at the back of the page, there's only a couple of places that we see dots that got circled, so for the most part it did pretty good. But when we see the back, we know that we can't do any writing on the back because of the amount of ghosting.
So what nib and pen do I think is going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
Always good and always shading. So if you like shading dusty purples, this is a dealer's choice. I don't know that I can say that it has a pen that it does better in. It always delivers on really what would be expected, and only in the double broad did I really see some tone variation from the others. So I'm pretty impressed. I got to get another sample. Now, if you don't think, if you don't like dusty shading purples, that's what I meant to say, then I don't think any pen would make you enjoy using this ink.
I hope you got something out of this video, and if you want to be able to follow me over on Instagram, I'm there as an ink guy. Thanks for watching.